Hello, sisters. Welcome to the Sacred Medicine Podcast, weaving powerful, soulful practices into functional medicine. Step into this beautiful space of devotion and explore everything from nurturing foods, rituals, sexuality, and awakening your innate sensuality. It is time to own your radiance. This is the Sacred Medicine Podcast. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Sacred Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Margaret Romero. And if you are joining for the first time, welcome. This podcast is meant to combine and blend functional medicine along with sacred practices to help empower women and help them live their life fully and openly. And today's guest is Jennifer Racioppi. She is an astrologer and a coach for female entrepreneurs. She is the founder of Lunar Logic Revolution, a movement for the modern woman so that she can achieve her dreams in complete alignment with the fullest expression of herself. She is also a Duke Integrative Medicine certified health coach, and as well as a coach for female entrepreneurs. So today we talk about something that I totally am into, lunar cycles or moon cycles. And what we talk about are how to actually know how to create a life sort of around lunar cycles. And she uses this specifically for women entrepreneurs and how you can lean on lunar cycles to help enhance your business style. You know, when you're actually going to be on stage speaking or when you're going to be launching something in your business. And so it's good to know where you are in these cycles. Then she goes into how to, let's say you are trying to compare your menstrual cycle with your lunar cycle. She shows you exactly how to do that. Some women are completely aligned with the moon, which means that they are getting their period during the new moon and they are ovulating during the full moon time. Now, you don't necessarily, some women don't follow that at all, which that is totally fine too. And so we talk about what to do if you're not aligned with the lunar cycles, and also what to do if you're menopausal and you don't have a period anymore. So we go all into that, which is really cool. And then we end our conversation with talking about the full moon in June. And she talks all about that, and which sounds like it's going to be an amazing full moon. It's going to be in Sagittarius. At this point, Jupiter will be going direct. It has been in retrograde for some time. It is going direct, which means lots of really good abundance. But we go all into detail about this. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I hope you learn something about lunar cycles and how you can lead your life and your business to get the most out of it by, the moon and also your menstrual cycles. Well, on to the show. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Sacred Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Margaret Romero, and today I have Jennifer Racioppi, who is an astrologer and coach for female entrepreneurs, and I am so delighted to have you. Thanks for being on the show today, Jennifer.
Oh my God, thank you so much for having me. Such a pleasure.
Yeah, I initially found you on Instagram. And I know that you are not only an astrologer, which is badass, but you are also into moon cycles. And that's like kind of my jam. And I would love to hear so much more about that. But let's start off with how you even, you do have quite an interesting beginning of your journey with astrology. So why don't you take us back to that time?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love what you're up to in terms of talking about moon cycles, but also bringing the functional medicine perspective and lens. to healing. Yeah, yeah. And I will say, as a woman who really struggled in my teens, in the 90s, with hormonal imbalances at a time when functional medicine really didn't exist, and we were at the very beginning phases of really even understanding what integrative medicine was. I was on a path where I had these horrific periods, really, really, really intense periods, and they defined so much of my teenage years, periods that were so long and so heavy that sometimes I couldn't stay in school, had to leave school early. They just disrupted my social life. Tons of mood swings, highs and lows. And I had been through the gamut before, I had even graduated high school. And every time I had gone to the doctor to figure out what was going on with me, I was told I was a normal teenage girl with imbalanced hormones, and they would put me on the pill. And so I had been on multiple variations of the pill, each one maybe solving a certain issue I had, but recreating a whole different drama. If it wasn't like depression and more mood swings, it was like nausea. And so that was my treatment plan as a teenager, was just like, let's just get the pill down and then hope that you're okay. And what had happened is that I had something way more significant brewing in my body. And maybe 6 weeks after, I was actually 6 weeks, 20 years ago in July, in 1997, 6 weeks after I graduated high school, I had a tumor erupt inside my left ovary. I had a tumor that had grown so big that it pushed into my diaphragm and I couldn't breathe.
Wow.
Yeah. And I fell to the floor, crawled to the phone, and dialed 911. And had an emergency trip to the hospital that later, developed into a surgical procedure to remove the ovary as well as the tumor. Within a couple of weeks, I had received a stage 1 ovarian cancer diagnosis.
Wow.
Yeah, which was actually rescinded. It wasn't a diagnosis that, like, after I had multiple pathology reports, it was like a very confusing, like, pre-cancer cancer. So I didn't actually go into chemotherapy at that point. I was put under strict surveillance, had another surgery to make sure that nothing had spread. And they thought I had been surgically cured with the removal of the tumor. And 1 year later, I had a second cancer diagnosis, an endometrial cancer diagnosis that was actually very aggressive and resulted in a radical hysterectomy. So that was 1998. I was 19 years old, and I went from really having a dysfunctional menstrual cycle that was never quite normal into radical surgical menopause. And so, as a teenager, I didn't really have a clue what was going on with me. And I certainly didn't understand what being postmenopausal meant. And again, it was the 90s. So there wasn't, the internet barely existed. There wasn't a lot of resources online online didn't exist. So it wasn't like I could go Google, figure out how to kill your life after cancer.
My gosh.
So, and I was obviously just a clearly very sensitive woman. Anyway, so I went on a life healing journey. I started having really intense panic attacks, really intense depression, and basically panic and depression just drove me to make some really bold moves. One of which was to take a leave of absence from college and relocate to the West Coast. So I grew up on the East Coast, and I was in college at the time, and it wasn't really working out because I was just, menopause is really intense for anyone.
Yeah.
And menopause usually takes a number of years of the perimenopausal transition into the slow and steady decline of hormones. And then, once you're 1 year without your period, you're proclaimed postmenopause.
Right.
Well, for me, it happened overnight and was parachute. And so I was having trouble cognitively, like reading, digesting information at school. And then, of course, just the post-traumatic stress that accompanied all this really complicated things. So good old California became like this gigantic hug in my life, where I was able to take a step back from school. I moved to San Diego, was living at the beach, and just prioritized healing. And for me, that looked like reading everything I could, making changes to my diet, understanding nutrition, understanding meditation, starting up a yoga practice, and diving in. And quite honestly, it got me some results, but it didn't really bring it all together for me. So I continued on my journey, and I moved up to Lake Tahoe to teach ski lessons, honestly. And it was the end of ski season, and I was really confused. And I walked into a metaphysical bookstore, and I had a tarot card reading done. And this woman, she just rocked my world, forever changed my life. Like as a really good psychic would know, she was able to pick up on so much dysfunction around the feminine in my life and the fact that I wasn't cycling. And she was actually quite honest. She's like, I see two paths ahead of you. One is like, you get sick. She's like, I see you've been sick. You may get sick again. She's like, part of your healing process is figuring out what you actually want to do with your life and embracing your joy and pleasure and these feminine principles. And she said, if you do that, she's like, I actually see you living this like really vibrant life. So it was like one of those like, what?
Wow.
In your face tarot card readings. And so she followed up with this understanding of lunar rhythms that she herself had spent her whole life living in sync with. And she was one of these people who had never really set foot in a city. She had only been to San Francisco once or twice. It was energetically overwhelming for her. She spent most of her life on the west shore of Lake Tahoe. She lived with the Hopi, Indians, Native Americans for a while. And her family had these traditions around following the phases of the moon passed down from generation to generation since pre-Christian times in Ireland. And so she was this keeper of sacred ceremonial knowledge.
Wow.
And yeah, so she invited me to a sweat lodge in her house, and I went to a sweat lodge. And that was like the first version of an initiation with her. And then for a couple of years, she mentored me on how to do lunar rituals. So new moon intentions, waning, waxing moon rituals, full moon rituals. And that became a really big turning point in my life for starting to understand what was never really right with my menstrual cycle, meaning it was a cycle, and then replacing what I had lost with my hysterectomy. And then also learning how to prioritize desire. And she gave me some really good counsel around like me really understanding what I wanted to do and how to manifest and live. So I will just say also that I don't, while my family is wonderful and they've offered me resources as I needed along the way, I didn't at that time have a family that had a ton of financial resources, and to some degree emotional resources. They had their own trauma at that point. And so I was pretty much on my own to figure out how I was going to pay for college, how I was going to figure out college, how I was going to stay healthy, how I was going to navigate my doctor's appointments. It was a lot.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It was overwhelming. And so the moon and my mentor, Debbie, helped me usher into this radical abundance where I didn't really have much in terms of support, but I was able to figure it all out. And so, yeah, that was in 2001, and that was 16 years ago. And I've been living with La Luna ever since.
Now, let me ask you this. Were you put on bioidentical hormones?
Oh, yeah. Not at the time. I was actually put on Premarin because, remember, I had my hysterectomy in 1998. So bioidentical hormones did not exist, right? This was pre the Women's Health Initiative, where everyone was just put on Premarin, that was the thing.
Right.
And so for your listeners who don't know what's Premarin is a conjugated equine hormone, meaning it comes from a horse. So it's made from pregnant urine, like pregnant horse urine, that's then conjugated into a pill. So I was on 1.25 milligrams of Premarin a day. And I didn't actually successfully get off of Premarin until I found a functional medicine doctor. And that wasn't until much later who would mess with me because even though I sought it out, it was controversial and for many reasons. So I made the switch to bioidentical hormones much later. And yes, I do take them.
Oh, okay. And just going back to what you were saying about the estrogen made from pregnant horses' urine, the body doesn't recognize that, and therefore it's not called bioidentical. And so the body doesn't know how to break it down and metabolize it and excrete it naturally, which is why it did create havoc in women's bodies. Way back then, if you were on it for many, for a long time, like many women were, it could potentially have caused issues. But bioidentical is a healthier and more natural approach.
I will say, and this is a different conversation, but it is a nuance, that one of my concerns of being 20 years post-menopause and a woman in my 30s certainly was not recreating cancer in my body through taking hormones that would lead to that. Was a huge concern for me. Another concern, which honestly, unfortunately, is manifested, is osteoporosis. So the hormones are so important to prevent osteoporosis. And while I metabolize the bioidenticals really, really, really well, I'm still struggling on how to keep bone. And so I'll just throw that out there as a nuance to all this, as reason why it's just so important to protect our ovaries and our uterus and the natural hormones in our bodies, because it gets very complicated when we don't have those natural resources. And, so much of my work is driven by this idea of helping women live in harmony with their cycles and their rhythms, because bioidenticals are wonderful for women who need them in many ways. And they're really not a replacement for healthy, robust ovaries, hormonal rhythms.
Right, of course.
Yeah. And it's complicated. So I love the work you're up to, and I love what you're doing, because, this is about helping women stay in sync. So their bones are protected, and their breasts are protected, and their hearts are protected. And of course, their fertility and their well-being and their feminine resources as well.
Yes. Yes. And I'm assuming that since you're seeing a functional medicine provider, that you're on all kinds of supplements, including calcium and K2 and all of that. Good stuff.
Girl.
You must.
Yeah. One day I should do like an Instagram stories of my medicine closet. It's just like everything, like my day is like, wow, already today I've had like it's an in-depth regimen, but yes, of course.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I take a slew of supplements on a daily basis, so I get it. I had to just recently buy I couldn't find a big enough, how, those like pill packs that say like Monday through Sunday, and like the regular size ones that are like for people for just like once a day or twice a day. Those are too small for the amount of supplements that I take.
Yeah, I could never do that, because I mean, even when I travel, like, people are like, "Why are you traveling with so much?" Like, I'm like, "Do you understand how many vitamins I take?"
I know. I have this a couple week trip planned in June, and I'm like, oh my God, what am I gonna like? This little thing will not house 3 weeks worth. Like, it'll house maybe a week and a half, maybe if that. Not even, probably a week. And so I have to put them all into like little baggies, and then like everything has to be labeled.
You got it. And that's just a version of self-care, right? Sometimes self-care is easy and it feels good, and sometimes self-care is expensive, and like vitamins, it's like a huge, I have to budget for it, because it's important.
Absolutely.
To travel.
Oh,
and then there's, just a version of self-care of like, how do I travel? Because sometimes I travel for a month at a time to speak and, teach and do the things I do. And it's like, I have to really think that through in terms of, my morning vitamins, my afternoon vitamins, my evening vitamins, my herbs, even like my weight training and how I do my strength training. I have whatever you call those bands that are like the resistance bands.
Right.
They're easy to travel with, whereas weights obviously aren't. And
exactly.
Routines I can do in the morning when I'm on the road. It's complicated, but it's also just self-care. And I've just learned to accept my body as my medicine this lifetime. And this is what I was born into. And so this is what I'm dealing with. And my job is to do the best I can for her and let her usher me into my next level of wisdom, power, grace, whatever it is, without begrudging the medicine. And it doesn't mean it's always easy, I have my own issues right now around infertility and trying to create a family, and it's challenging. There's a lot I deal with, and also just being a steward for what this lifetime is, and showing up. So yeah, I get the vitamin conundrum.
Yeah, and then the probiotics. What am I going to do? Is there refrigerated? Is there a refrigerator where I'm going? It's how am I going to keep it cold on the? It's like a lot to think about. And then I'm gluten-free, and so traveling also entails me bringing some gluten-free foods.
Oh yeah, gluten-free is like is such a blessing, right? Because it's like healed me in so many ways. I honestly think I probably had my endometrial cancer was linked to gluten intolerance, as was my hormonal dysregulation as a child and as a teenager, because I grew up in a really Italian family and a really patriarchal Italian family. And there was no shortage of bread and pasta, but I never felt good. And now looking back on the research of seeing like how gluten intolerance is linked to hormonal dysregulation and endometrial cancer, I'm pretty convinced that gluten was at the forefront of my depression, and my hormonal dysregulation, and possibly even a link to my cancer. So yeah, gluten-free is an inconvenience and also like a liberating. I'm like, whoa, thank God I understand that part.
Exactly. Well, let's jump into moon cycles.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that and how you practice it, and what are some of the things that you teach?
Yeah. So moon cycles were one of those like off the beaten path, and certainly 16 years ago, very limited resources around what it was and how to work with it that were like honestly just wasn't a silver bullet. I still had to do a lot of therapy, and obviously I still had to take care of my health in really specific ways, and that I'm consistently figuring out. And moon cycles were this portal into power that I didn't even know existed, right? So for me, it started with understanding how was I affected, because I was dealing with depression and anxiety. So moons for me, I didn't know my depression and anxiety changed with the phases of the moon, until I started tracking them. So it began for me just keeping a journal of how I felt with the different phases of the moon. And then through the work with Debbie was like these very specific rituals on how to work with new moon, full moon, waning, and waxing moon that just became what I did, right? So it was like, oh, it's a new moon. Let me gather my things. What am I needing this new moon? What is my intention this new moon? And let me work with this. It was like I was living, in the 12-step recovery, they say, what do they say? Take it one day at a time. Well, in my like priestess, hormonal health debauchery recovery, like I was living one moon cycle at a time. It just became this way of being that got so ingrained in my psyche that is pretty much a non-negotiable for me. But to answer your question more specifically around what I did, well, first I just started to understand what the new moon was, what the full moon was, what the waning moon was, what the waxing moon was, and started understanding how I felt. And then from there, started to understand the potential and the power of each of these phases of the moon in terms of a new moon being a time to set an intention, or the waxing moon being a time to add energy to it, invigorate it, live in the upcycle, the Venus week, the excitement of what would be the follicular phase of my menstrual cycle, which I didn't have. So feeling like that natural increase, that uptick. And then the full moon being this time of reverence and receptivity and recharging myself. And also understanding how to guard and protect my energy, because I didn't realize that my anxiety was really provoked at full moon. So learning how to protect myself, quite honestly, at the full moon. And then obviously waning moon would be the flip side of that. So understanding that would be the luteal phase of my cycle, where I was retreating, coming more within myself, understanding that maybe I'd be more psychically in tuned, and it was a time to let things go. So clean house, let things go, create space. And so I could get ready to repeat the cycle next new moon. Over time, I started to understand that each new moon and full moon happened in sync with an astrological sign, and that we were constantly cycling through the zodiac. So I started to learn the zodiac in that way. And then little by little, it's like, oh, this is astrology, right? So astrology was something that was like, I learned astrology through applied ritual and applied astrological phenomenon, like learning to sync my life with the phases of the moon, and then learning to sync myself with the zodiac, started to introduce me to bigger understanding of all the cycles of the cosmos. Yeah. Do you have specific questions about that, or I don't know if I really answered your question?
Okay, so you went through like a little brief snippet of each cycle. What are we finding here? So what specific things do you do, I guess, during those times? If you could give like maybe some examples.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I think I gave more of an overbreath instead of specifics is because for me, it's really changed. I mean, I've been doing this for a really long time. And when I first started, it was, I would honor the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water. Well, first of all, it started like the new moon started with like a ceremonial bath, right? So I would take a salt water bath. So that meant like magnesium or Epsom salts in a bath. And I would like cleanse and consecrate my body and then adorn it with certain oils. And then I would sage my home and clear my home and set the tone and till the chambers, close the doors, turn off everything, and have this like sacred moment when then I would like evoke the elements, earth, air, fire, and water, nod to each direction, east, north, west, and south, honor the sun and the moon, the Lord and the Lady, create sacred space, write out my intention with the new moon. And it was like this production.
Right.
And then the waxing moon, I would revisit my intention from the new moon. I would candle carve. So I would do a candle carving ritual, but then I would be like, so this new moon, I'm calling in this. And then I would create and dress a candle that would further call that in, and then I would be burning this candle up until the time of the full moon. The full moon meant like I would repeat that new moon ritual in terms of like adorning my body and cleaning the energy of my home and saging everything. But I would go outside and I would do this drawing down the power of the moon ritual, where I would have my wand, my empom, and I would direct it to the moon, and I would like embody and invoke the power of the moon and start to understand there was like a ceremonial way to have like a cookie that then would sit outside and be infused in the power of the moon, or I would create prosperity water. And even like have like a little glass of wine that was like ceremonious. And I would introduce my girlfriend to these practices. So I wasn't always doing them alone. There would be, I had my girlfriends who would also practice with me. And then the waning moon would be a fire burning ceremony where I would think about what's blocking me still from receiving what I need. What do I need to let go of? And I would do this very sacred fire burning ceremony. And these were the rituals that Debbie taught me that her family had been doing for eons, that were passed down. And they were actually very specific. Over time, I realized I didn't need that level of specificity. Like this was ingrained in my body, and I had my own intuitive way of working with the moon cycles. And so it's become much less programmed, though those rituals and learning sacred art of rituals and being initiated through being through a priestess lineage, where I learned those cycles, I taught those cycles, I learned those rituals, I taught those rituals, I learned those incantations, those chants, the spells, really. And then I taught them, and now they're in my repertoire, they're in my encyclopedia, but they're not necessarily what I do. So what I do now is I set intentions still with the phases of the moon, but I do it in a way that where I really understand the astrological influences of that lunar cycle, where it's in my chart, what it's impacting. I have what I worked on last moon cycle, so what's still evolving, what's still evoking. I understand lunar phase gestation, so if this is a full moon, what was the correlating new moon that I'm still working with that. I work really specifically with the waxing and the waning phases from an astrological perspective, and it's much more embodied and less scripted, meaning I don't necessarily do these rituals in this said way ever. I do what I need, and I figure out what I need based on looking at my life, looking at my astrological chart, understanding all the current planetary cycles. And then like I let life show me what it needs. What do I feel like doing today? And that may be going outside and hanging out under a full moon, which I always recommend. It may be a formal ceremony. It may also just be like taking a very high impact exercise class. New moons for me are always very sacred, so I always try to carve out time to be very silent with the new moon. But it's a hard question to answer because now I'm at this point where I do what I need. And what I need is informed by what's happening in my life, what's happening in my chart, what did and didn't happen the moon cycle previous, what I hope to happen the moon cycle that's coming next, and where I'm at in sync with all of these cycles because they're all connected. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I love that you went into such depth initially. When you were giving some of these examples of what you used to do. Have you found, like, why would a woman who maybe has never done this, why would she want to, or why would you recommend her starting to sort of do this? What benefits have you found for yourself, or that a woman who's never done this, what benefits could she see in her life?
In my programs, I've worked primarily in doing one-to-one with women, and recently I've started some group work. And so I just ended a 3-month program where I took 24 women in a very intimate group coaching process through 3 lunar cycles. And the changes that they received, the changes that they got, right, were really substantial in that they started to really understand who they were, really understand how to be who they are. There was this understanding of like just really getting the order of how their emotions played out and the cycles that they were living in such a way where they could anticipate their feelings, they could anticipate what was going to happen next, and that helped them feel more embodied, more grounded, more confident. We work through a lot. So it's a really intense psychological processing tool where you start to understand what comes up for you in your psyche throughout the duration of the lunar cycle. And so to bring it back to my story, had someone taught this to me in my teenage years, I might not have manifested cancer because there would have been a way for me to process the deep psychological things that were happening in my psyche. And certainly if I knew gluten-free, and certainly if I knew functional medicine, I would have had a lot more tools at my hand. But the emotional piece, the mind-body piece, I can't say didn't highly affect what happened to me as a teenager. And one of the benefits of working with the lunar phases is that we get way more in touch with what's happening in our mind and what's happening in our body and what's happening with that mind-body connection, but also the transpersonal of connecting to the cycles of the cosmos, in that we can process, right, what's coming up from us, for us, in a way where we clean the closets of our heart, mind, and soul. And doing so just has tremendous impacts on our well-being, on our ability to show up in our relationships, on our ability to show up in our sexual being, right? Of like knowing like, this is how I express myself. This is how I hold my power in relationship. This is what I want in my professional life. This is the time I'm going to ask for a raise. This is the time I'm going to cultivate more abundance, conjure, create. It's just this opening of power, really, that works on multi levels. But I would say the psychological mind-body connection is uncanny. And what I'm seeing with my clients is just this level of confidence where they're owning themselves. It's not like their lives are miraculously different. It's not like they've all walked away multimillionaires, or if they had relationship problems going into it, they weren't still struggling with relationship problems. Like, no, this isn't a miracle. You know what I mean? It's actually quite practical, and the change is incremental. It's incremental.
Mm-hmm.
However, incremental change over long term is miracle. And sometimes there are breakthroughs that are like instantaneous, life changing understandings of self or material manifestations that are game changing. That doesn't happen every month, but it does happen. I would say more over time is the incremental understanding of knowing who you are, being who you are, living in sync with rhythms, living in sync with your body's rhythms, living in sync with your cycles, and cleaning out the closet of your mind in such a way where your body can hum even more effectively, and you are a fine-tuned instrument to create what you want this lifetime. And one last thing I will add is that, I focus specifically on moon cycles, not menstrual cycles, in this group coaching program. And so they could get the zodiac down, and they could get the phases of the moons down. And ironically, many of them did, their menstrual cycles did start to sync up with the moon cycle. So they were bleeding with new moon and ovulating with full moon. And that happened over 3 months' time. And that's not the goal. I don't think we have to bleed with the new moon and ovulate with the full moon. There's many ways to sync in cycles. And, you can have the reverse flow. There's no perfect way to do this. There's no right way to do this. There's no wrong way to do it. I think it's important to say that. However, it was interesting to see that they sunk, like there was a trend. Not all of them, but majority of them had changes in their cycles.
So now for a woman who's no longer menstruating, she can still follow these moon cycles.
Oh yeah, that's the magic. That's the glory, and that's what I gained. It's like as a menopausal woman, I still had all the benefits of cycling. And I still do, and I will for the rest of my life.
And basically are you just, let's say it's a full moon, and then you said that that's a time when your body would typically be ovulating, and a time of like sort of recharging and all of that and being in full receptivity. You're still, even though you're menopausal, you're still sort of going by what the moon cycles are.
You got it.
Right. Okay. Okay. Cool. So how does a woman know then, how does she start to do this? Then what is the best way? She's not mapping out her menstrual cycle, like you said. So she's looking pretty much just at the moon cycles, and she's finding when the full moon, the new moon, the waxing, and the waning moons, right? Mm-hmm. She's finding out when they are, and then what does she do?
She charts it. So I would say the easiest way to do this is to get, and what my Ayurvedic practitioner told me in 2001, in addition to Debbie teaching me how to do this, he's like, just go to the metaphysical bookstore and get one of those calendars where it shows you the phases of the moon, and start to take notes on like what you feel when the moon is in that phase and that phase and that phase. And that was honestly, it was some of the best advice I ever got. It's like I think we overcomplicate these things, and certainly I tend towards perfectionism and extremism, right? Like wanting to do it perfect and wanting to do it all the way and all these things. And I think many women do, which is why I mention it. However, this could be really simple, which is just, I love the Wee Moon. That's been the one I bought for like 16 years, but there's so many calendars out there that just show you when the moon cycles, when the moon's changing, signs, when the moon's like growing and waning, and when the new moons are, when the full moons are, and to keep notes. Oh, I felt good here. I felt good there. I didn't feel great there. Or for me, it was like, oh my God, I'm a crazy person at the full moon. This full moon thing is like, I don't feel good. I feel great at new moons. So to just start to monitor your own energy, because everyone's going to feel different. Everyone's going to have a different experience. And every new and full moon is going to affect you differently in your chart. It's going to hit a different house. It's going to aspect different planets. So it's important for you to know yourself, right? That's first step. Just know yourself. How do I feel in sync with these rhythms? And to start to do it long enough where you can develop some sense of analysis. I would say 3 lunar cycles is certainly 1 lunar cycle. You're going to get some information, but if you do it for 3, you're going to start to really understand it. And I think that that's step 1. I think step 2 is then to understand the influence of the moon. So new moons are times for setting intentions. Truly, you're seeding new things. So to start thinking about your goals or your soul-driven desires in sync with new moons. So to understand what seeds you want to plant at new moons, I think is also a really just easy next step. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally. What was I going to say? Oh, do you know if there's an app that tracks where you can sort of write it, rather than buying a calendar? Do you know if there's an app for that?
I don't. I don't do much. Someone just told me about an app that I'm trying to research for a resource list for my clients. So I'm going to get this somehow put together, because I know people have this question all of the time. I actually am in process of creating something myself because it's asked so much. But I don't know off the top of my head a specific app. I use a really advanced astrological software that isn't really applicable for the beginner. And then for my clients, I create like a lunar diary for them to keep track of things, and I outline the phases and the signs for them. But I don't have the specifics of an app off the top of my head. I'm forgetting the name of the one I was just looking at. It was like an Apple app, but it didn't actually give you a diary. There was nothing like that.
I see.
So, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, now I know that you work with female entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
And how do you relate all of this? How does this benefit a woman who's got a business or running a business? How can this benefit her?
Yay. So this is one of my favorite questions. Okay. So as women, we are pretty much tuned into the cosmos, whether we realize it or not. So just understanding that we're tuned into the cosmos and that there's going to be energetic highs and energetic lows, I think first and foremost just takes the pressure off of it being awesome all the time. Right? Once we understand that we're not supposed to always feel like totally turned on and invigorated and everything's working at peak all of the time, there's a sense of like, okay, let me take a step back and figure this out. But more specifically, to understand, your chart and to understand the power of your transits and when you're in a time when you should be pushing to get things out, versus a time when like, actually right now you need to retreat. You're in a time of inner looking, of inner dwelling, of like inner understanding. And this is where you're going to get your biggest gains is by going a little bit more radio silent and doing the inner work, right? So just understanding the macro cycles of your chart and then understanding the macro cycles of the cosmos so that we are working with cycles rather than pushing against cycles, right? Because one of my former taglines and still favorite sayings is success isn't a race, it's a rhythm. And when we figure out our rhythm and we figure out the rhythm of the cosmos and the rhythm of the cycles, we can just continue forward with rhythmicity, in a way that allows us to not reinvent the wheel constantly, but sink into the cycles of knowing our time's destiny. So that's the biggest way. And then beyond that, knowing certain marketing strategies around astrology, knowing when things, like if you're in a Jupiter cycle, so Jupiter represents good luck, good fortune, and abundance, and you are in a cycle where Jupiter's going to be to your sun sign, or Jupiter's going to be to your midheaven, or Jupiter's going to be to your rising sign or your moon, that's a time for growth. That's a time for gaining wisdom and expansion and abundance. So that's a time to be networking and to be really putting yourself out there for bigger opportunities. If you're in a Saturn cycle, Saturn represents discipline and structure and hard work. That may mean growth through subtraction, right? You're going to have to actually get really specific and really focused so that you can understand what the soul's essence is of what you're up to right now. And so there's different work coaching principles that you might utilize during a Saturn cycle, right? So understanding how the planets are affecting you in your own personal life. I also look at things like progressed moons in your chart. So your natal moon is with the position of where the moon was when you took your first breath. The transiting moon is where's the moon in the sky right now. And then we also have this thing called the progress chart, which looks at the psychological development of your chart based on the first 100 days of your life. It's kind of complicated to explain, but your progressed moon tells me where you're psychologically developing now. So knowing the sign of your progressed moon, knowing the house of your progressed moon gives us clues on what's most pertinent for you to be working on now. And your progressed moon works in like basically 30-month cycles. So they're longer cycles. But understanding the placement of your progressed moon is really a wonderful thing. And then there's understanding even more nuances, right? So, is the moon void of course, right? The void of course moon means the moon is no longer making aspects in a particular sign before it ingresses into the next sign, which is kind of complicated. And when we understand it, the void of course moon isn't necessarily a time to launch that big internet marketing campaign or send out that request for new signups for your program or do something. It's more of a time to like get things off your desk or things that aren't necessarily you wanting to produce a specific result. So timing and strategizing your outcomes with the best times to get them done from a cosmic weather standpoint is a way to not fight the rhythm, right? There's a rhythm happening at all times, and we can either fight it and push it, and that leads to, in my experience, a lot of adrenal fatigue and a lot of frustration. Or we can understand that we're not meant to go all the time, and that there's going to be times where we can get more done because it's aligned either for our body's rhythms, for our psychological development, or for the metacycles of the cosmos. And we can put our energy and effort there to hopefully find the rhythm and sync it up so things start to naturally unfold. So we're not always working off of adrenaline, and we're preserving our ability to stay in sync with our rhythms, our circadian rhythms, our monthly rhythms, our ultradian rhythms, our infradian rhythms, our circadian rhythms, so that we are honoring the yin and the yang. I call it the lunar and the logic, so that we are in sync with our need to rest and our need to produce, right? Understanding that we as women, our bodies are our biggest asset, our resource, our intuition. And so preserving them in such a way where we're working in sync with them and the cosmos is just a fabulous tool for women, particularly women entrepreneurs.
Yeah, thanks. That was great. Because I think that a lot of female entrepreneurs that come to see me in my practice who are burnt out, who have low adrenal function, who have thyroid issues and hormone imbalances and things like that, they tend to push all month long. Despite moon or menstrual cycles, they're just pushing when there are definitely times when you should be at rest and sort of restoring. And that's ultimately when women, the outcome is burnout, like you mentioned. So I definitely see that in practice as well.
Yeah. I mean, we're only as good, our businesses are only as good as as we are, quite honestly,
right?
Unless we've gotten to the point where they're completely delegated and someone else is running them completely. You know what I mean? And for most of the entrepreneurs I work with, they're still very much involved in their businesses. And so it's essential to take care of our health in order to be in peak performance and peak productivity, and to dismantle the belief that peak performance and peak productivity means all work all the time, exalted. It's just like that's a myth, and that's patriarchal, and that's masculine,
right,
and
totally.
it doesn't actually work, right?
It totally breaks our body down, big time. So what happens if a woman is, let's say we're looking at the moon cycles and she's saying, okay, well, during the full moon, and she's tracking it. Let's say she's tracking it, and what is meant to be during the full moon is no, let's take the new moon. Let's just take that's more setting intention and sort of quiet time and things like that. But in her menstrual cycle, and I know you said you don't really work with that, but what if in her menstrual cycle she feels really good and she wants to, it's at a time of her cycle where she's feeling recharged and kind of like ready to go, but the moon is saying, well, no, this is a time to retreat. What if there's sort of conflicting?
Yeah, no, I get it. And I also just want to say that in this particular program I did, we weren't working with the menstrual cycle. We were just working with the moon cycle. But certainly in my private practice and in my work with women, we do absolutely chart the menstrual cycle. It was just in this particular instance, we weren't focusing on that, which is why I brought it up, because they did sync without even focusing on it.
Okay.
Which was interesting. But, deferring to your body is always, I think, your primary tool. So again, I'm just going to come back to one of the fundamental principles that underlie all my work. Knowing who you are and being who you are is the secret to your success, right? So knowing your body's rhythm and being in sync with your body's rhythm is the secret to your success. So to answer your question succinctly, what if the body is in conflict with the moon? What if you're reverse cycling or whatnot? And so I always think that women know their best answer, and this isn't about me telling them what to do and that this is what the new moon means and blah, 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 blah. So I think it's about them discerning for themselves what needs to get done. Now, the universal principle of the new moon is still that the sun and the moon come into an alignment at that exact moment where the masculine properties of the sun aligns with the feminine properties of the moon, the yin and the yang, however you want to define it, if you want to take gender definition out of it, which I know is really important to do as well. It's just these properties of fertility come together at the exact same degree in the sky, known as a conjunction. And the moon and the sun, that we do not receive any moonlight when the sun and the moon come into configuration. So it's a dark night.
Right.
It's a dark night. And it's also a very fertile time. So whether you feel like running a marathon on a new moon, or you feel like getting lots of sleep on a new moon is not necessarily the key takeaway here. It's to understand that the universe is giving you a gift of planting new seeds. So whether that's in sync with your cycle or not, that's still the case. So you can still use moon magic, whether your cycle's involved in that or not, right? Whether you're opposing it or you're working perfectly in harmony with it, or it's somewhere in between. And then to understand what your body's needs are. So if you have a ton of energy and it is the new moon and you are someone who's very highly energized with the new moon, or you ovulate with the new moon, to understand how to use that productively, and then also concretely know the flip side too, so that when everyone's hyperstimulated at a full moon, because we are receiving so much moonlight, and you are at your moon cycle, meaning you're starting to bleed, how do you handle the hyperstimulation of the external world when you are in a time for you to do the more internal yin work of quiet?
Right.
And it's not so much about being perfect in sync with the cycles of the moon. It's understanding that we can't be full throttle 29 out of 29 days a cycle, right? That we're not meant to constantly be at a 10. So it's still honoring the cycles of rhythmicity in your own life, and crafting self-care practices that reflect your own inner needs, despite the bigger, grander cycles that are happening for everyone else. Does that make sense? So it's just understanding nuance, really, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And crafting self-care so that it aligns with it. That's my personal philosophy. I'm curious what you think about it.
Well, I think that, I go by how my body feels, despite despite the moon. Like, let's say I am menstruating during the full moon. That's not a time for me to be like working out at the gym or giving a big talk and so I typically go, because my body is just responding to my menstrual cycle. And so I typically will lean into that a little bit more, knowing though that there's a full moon right now, and I can certainly still do the ritual, like a ritual that I'm doing at home, but releasing and blah, blah, blah. But I'm not out there like, oh, full moon means I can, whatever, work out a ton, or this is time to give a talk, but my body is saying no to that. So I do honor the body before I do honor what the moon is saying. I'm honoring the body first.
Yeah, and I think that it's complicated, right? Because so much of patriarchy is like, give me the 5 steps to perfect, whatever it is, or like, you tell me what I need to do. And when we're working with the feminine, it's actually like, I'm going to hold space for you to source your own wisdom. And I'm going to give you some guidelines, right? And I'm going to help you understand for you what it is, so that you can make your own decisions. And that's really what I think the power of this work is discernment based on what you need, and self-knowledge based on where you're at. And there is a level of education that needs to happen with that. Like, we do concretely need to know what these things are and how they impact us. And then from there, I really teach it, like, take a step back and journal and develop for yourself what your body's response is to this, so that you can craft specifically to your needs. But that's not so easy to teach, because it's really asking the client or the listener to take ownership in their own healing journey, and to not just defer to what the teacher, the guide, the doctor, whoever it is, says, but to take it in with a grain of salt, understand the principles, and then apply it with discernment, discretion, and self-knowledge.
Right. That was great. I wanted to, before we start wrapping up, can we just quickly go over what may be happening like in the next month or so, astrology-wise, with the full moon, that we can sort of look forward to?
Yay! Yeah, I love that question. So, knowing that we're looking basically, the end of May, beginning of June, what I think is most exciting about the upcoming lunar phases um, is that every new and full moon is different, right? So just for your listeners to understand that every moon is different. We're never going to have the same moon twice. So even though there's overall principles about what a new moon means or what a full moon means, that when we really get into the aspects of the astrology, to look at what's influencing this full moon. So looking out in June, we have a fun full moon in Sagittarius. It's happening at 19 degrees of Sagittarius. And it's an interesting full moon because it deals with both Saturn and Jupiter. Jupiter, like I said, represents good luck, good fortune, and abundance. Saturn is the disciplinarian of the zodiac, and he shows us where we need to work. So he brings like almost a sober vibe. And so the full moon is going to be in Sagittarius, and right now Saturn's in Sagittarius. So the full moon is going to have a very Saturnian influence, meaning it may have a more sober feeling to it. It may feel more disciplined or structured, and this may be a moon you actually want to work with a formal ritual on because Saturn's there, and Saturn's about discipline and structure. What's also interesting about this full moon, is that it happens the same day that Jupiter, the planet of good luck, good fortune, and abundance, goes direct. So what do I mean by that? It means it's the day it stations to turn direct out of having been retrograde basically since early February. And so we're going to come into a time period where Jupiter is going to be more full throttle, more full steam. Jupiter represents abundance, prosperity, and expansion. And so Jupiter is also the ruler of Sagittarius. So if you're following, it's a Sagittarius full moon, and it's happening very close to Saturn because Saturn's in Sagittarius, which brings this feeling of focus. It's almost like could be a somber vibe. And Jupiter is going direct that same day, and Jupiter is the ruler of Sagittarius, so it's really important. So Jupiter represents abundance. So something we could do this full moon is set intentions to connect with the moon and have a structured ritual to go along with the moon. Not every full moon requires a structured ritual. I think that this could be a time for a structured ritual, and to particularly honor Jupiter because Jupiter is going to be stationing in the sky. Jupiter's gigantic. I mean, he's so huge. He's a titan of the solar system. So when he stations, he slows down to pivot his direction and his patterning and how he cycles. We feel it. So to connect directly with Jupiter on this full moon, I think would be a wonderful thing. Does that make sense? Is there more I can say about that?
Yeah. Well, so what's a good thing to do that night?
Yeah. So specifically to honor the full moon, to find some space where you can see the moon, and to carve out time. And on my calendar, it's going to be the 9th is a Friday. And I know you probably have listeners all over the world, so maybe that's a Saturday for them, depending if they're in Australia. But it's a weekend, so we're going to have some time this full moon to carve out some sacred practices. So I would say to carve out some time on this full moon and to connect with an intention for abundance, to connect with an intention for Jupiter. So for me, when I do work with Jupiter, I work with the color green because for me it symbolizes abundance. So something I'm going to do this full moon is actually say some chants to Jupiter and to definitely conjure a direct connection to Jupiter in terms of evoking Jupiter, talking to Jupiter, channeling Jupiter to get maybe some messages from my inner psyche that corresponds with Jupiter around what some messages are for me around how I can personally open up to more abundance. I'm certainly going to be evoking the color green and working with abundance. So for me, that will look like working with a green candle. So I'll chant to Jupiter. I'll use a green candle in correspondence with Jupiter. But again, I have a pretty big vernacular around these rituals. So let me just say something very simple for someone who's never done something like this before. Step 1 is to just know that the full moon's coming, right? Step 2 is to take time to carve out how you energetically feel with this full moon, knowing that it's going to be under a Saturnian influence. It might not be a high energy full moon. It might feel more like, oh, this is a moon for some serious soul work. And then to actually physically connect to the full moon. So get outside. If you can see the full moon, spend time under the full moon and just do some journaling. And then I would just say, have an invitation to Jupiter. Jupiter, talk to me. You're stationing in the sky. You roll good luck, good fortune, abundance. What do I need to know about where I'm blocking good fortune and abundance? Where do I need to know about where I can open up more to good fortune and abundance? And then ritualistically do something to intertwine that in your own life. So that may mean, like for me, burning a candle and saying a chant. For you, it may mean walking barefoot. It may mean standing naked under the full moon. It may mean doing something that feels very luxurious and abundant and joyful, like getting a massage that day, or using some really beautiful oils. I hate to overprescribe because every woman listening to this podcast is her own medicine chest,
right.
And she's her own purveyor of her own knowledge. So the invitation is to think for yourself what would help you connect with that sense of abundance and growth and joy, so that you could do something ritualistically to communicate to your subconscious that you're working in sync in this way.
Awesome. I love it. Thank you. That was great. So I have 3 really quick questions before we end this call. Let's see. First is, what is currently at your bedside?
Oh, okay. So my bedside, I'm currently keeping as little as possible. And some of that's because I realized that I had, for a while, my cell phone at my bedside because that was my alarm clock. So I've recently moved away from that, and I have a technology-free bedside, with the exception of my Echo Dot. So that is like an Amazon thing where it's like this, Alexa is her name, and I can talk to her before I go to bed, and I just say, Alexa, wake me up at this time.
Nice.
So it's like a pre-programmed alarm clock. But honestly, I'm trying to keep my bedroom really sacred. So I'm getting good sleep, and that means a lot of nothing. And I've moved to be quite honest, the Echo Dot. So I can just say, before I go to bed, wake me up at this time. And it's this really soft, beautiful alarm clock that gives me a little bit more space mentally and a little bit more technology-free bedroom.
Nice. What about your biggest indulgence? What is that?
Oh, yeah. So my biggest indulgences is that I've recently moved out of the city. So I lived 10 years in Brooklyn, and now I live full-time at what was my summer home in upstate New York in the Hudson Valley. And I would say that's my biggest indulgence, to be in nature, to live in a town of 823 people where it's basically comprised of summer camps and family-owned farms, and to do all my grocery shopping at like the Hawthorne Valley Farm, or these like local places, and cooking a lot of my own meals and getting really good sleep, and just dealing with all of the light pollution of the city.
And speaking of sleep, what do you wear to bed?
Sometimes it's a lot of nothing. That tends to be my go-to. Occasionally, it's some really comfortable, warm, fuzzy PJs. But I would say my tendency is a whole lot of nothing.
Okay, that seems to be a popular one here on the podcast. Yeah. And how can people find you?
You can find me on my website, which is jenniferracioppi.com, RACIOPPI. You can find me on Instagram at Jen, JENNRACIOPPI. You can search hashtag Lunar Logic, and that will probably direct you to me as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, this was so great. I loved everything that you were talking about. I'm so into the moon cycle. So I thank you so much for joining me today, and I will talk to you soon. And I'm going to be thinking about you during my full moon ritual on June 6th.
Oh, June 9th. June 9th.
Sorry, June 9th.
Yep.
Do you know what time that Eastern?
The full moon is? Let me just. I can email it to you if you want to put it in like show notes or something.
Oh, I'll put it in the show notes. Yeah, that'd be
perfect.
Great.
Cool.
Okay. All right. We'll have a beautiful weekend, and thank you so much. Well, I hope you enjoyed this interview with Jennifer, and hope you were able to take a look at your calendar and kind of find out when during the month, whether through your menstrual cycle or through the lunar cycles, kind of jot down how you feel and kind of keep a diary day to day and just see what's going on in the cosmos and how your body feels like, oh my God, I so am full of energy every full moon, or Every new moon, I just want to sleep, just to kind of keep track and know your cycle. So maybe you don't want to plan something around the new moon if you feel really tired. Like you don't want to plan like a weekend getaway filled with adventure if you know it's going to be some downtime required for your body. So to learn more about Jennifer and for all the show notes, head on over to margaretromero.com/episode 31. And if you have been loving all of these episodes, I would so love it if you can leave a review in iTunes. I would so appreciate it. We'll have the most beautiful week, and love to you all. Bye for now.